So again, this is the Agricultural Order 4.0 Introduction Workshop. This is the third of 3 workshops conducted in English. We're also conducting this same workshop in Spanish and Mandarin for non-English speaking interested parties. All workshops will be recorded and accessible via our website, even those that are not in English. So now I'm going to move on to introductions. I'm Diane Kugel. Elaine Saul and I supervise our 2 irrigated lands programs groups here in our office. So this is the first in a series of workshops that we will be having to help growers navigate Ag Order 4.0. Today's workshop is not technical in nature, and by that I mean that we won't be diving into the details on how to collect or report data. That's going to come in future workshops. In addition, today's workshop will not be providing specific details about exactly how a third party will help growers comply with Ag Order 4.0 requirements. But what we can tell you about a third party right now is that Matt Keeling, our executive officer, recently approved Central Coast Water Quality Preservation Inc., or Preservation Inc. for short, as the administrator of a region-wide third-party program that will assist participating members in complying with the order. Preservation Inc. will be providing folks with information about membership, their services, and options for growers to access those services at a later time. If you have questions about their services, please reach out to Preservation Inc.'s Executive Director, Sarah Lopez, or contact Preservation Inc.'s support line. And this contact information is included in 2 upcoming slides that you'll be seeing momentarily. Please note that information from Preservation Inc. will be available in time for growers to decide on membership before our water board's upcoming due date for updating growers' notice of intent on GeoTracker. And there'll be more on this particular issue and the due dates during our presentation. One more order of business. You may have heard that this order has been petitioned to the State Water Board, and this is true. Please note that all order requirements are in full effect during this petition process, however. So today our presentations will cover Ag Order 4.0 information and expectations for growers. Our presenters today are Lauren Gordon, Sarah Bragg-Flavin, and Jamie Pratt. And we also have Monica Baracarte and Jacqueline Tack on hand to help out as well. Elaine Saul and I are also here to chime in with any responses to questions if needed. And with that, let's get started with Lauren's portion of the workshop. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you, Diane. Good morning. My name is Lauren Gordon. So let's start off with logistics for our workshop today. The presentation is broken into 3 sections with a 10-minute break after the first section. The 3 sections that will be covered today are groundwater protection requirements, surface water requirements, and an overview of requirements for the next 3 years. Question and answer sessions are in place after each section. So in order to give you an opportunity to ask questions on that subject, please save your questions for one of the 3 Q&A sessions or write them in the chat box. During the Q&A session, please use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask a question, or go ahead and write your question in the chat box. We'll remind you of these instructions again when we go into the Q&A opportunities. Before we dig into this workshop, I wanted to make you aware of some resources that may be helpful to you to get up to speed on this material, and contacts that you have if you have any questions. On our website, you will find all important announcements and documents associated with Ag Order 4.0. There is a compliance calendar available on our website that provides due dates in a condensed spot and responses to frequently asked questions. You'll also find a list of technical assistance providers and consultants, plus information about available third-party programs that you can enroll in. Currently, Preservation Inc., as Diane had mentioned, is the only approved one, but there may be more options in the future. Also, please don't hesitate to contact the Irrigated Lands Program staff with questions. We are available by the Ag NOI email address on the screen here, or the phone number. You can also find our individual contact information on the front of our website. You'll see a link on the right side of the page called Irrigated Lands Program Contacts, where you can find our direct contact information. Moving on to the summary of today's workshop, we will start with what our goal is for today. We will also go over the current water quality concerns in our region and the crossover with agricultural practices. We will spend the majority of our time discussing Agricultural Order 4.0 requirements and providing an overview of the monitoring and reporting aspect of the order. Additionally, we will provide some tools and resources that are available to growers. There will be 3 question and answer sessions throughout the presentation. And at the end of this presentation, there will be an interactive survey that you as the attendees can fill out. The intention of this survey is to gather feedback on what kind of technical presentations and resources would be helpful to you with regards to complying with Agricultural Order 4.0. We will be using the results of this survey to inform us on topics for the future workshops, so they will be as useful as possible to you. In case you are not able to follow the adoption process, this presentation is geared towards people who are hearing this information for the first time. Today, we will cover the basics of Ag Order 4.0. We will provide a high-level overview of the order and its requirements, of which you'll need to comply with in the next few years. These requirements apply to growers whether they complete them individually or through a third-party program. We will provide an overview of the specific requirements due in the next 3 years. So please keep in mind that we will be providing follow-up workshops that are intended to go into more detail associated with the technical requirements of Ag Order 4.0. So what brings us here today? Growing crops is important, and the choices that growers make can have significant impacts on water quality. We understand that the relationship between irrigation and nitrogen are essential to grow crops, and how these components are managed is critical to maintaining and improving water quality. Both irrigation runoff and stormwater runoff are important to monitor as these are the main ways that water contaminants leave farmland, either by infiltrating to groundwater or as runoff to surface water. In groundwater, based on data that showed continued worsening water quality conditions in some areas, we are concerned about nitrate and 1,2,3-trichloropropane, or 1,2,3-TCP. We understand that 1,2,3-TCP is not commonly used in agricultural practices anymore. However, over the last few years, we have been collecting water quality data and have found 1,2,3-TCP in domestic wells, where we are also finding nitrate contamination. 1,2,3-TCP in drinking water is a public health concern that needs to be assessed. In surface water, we are also seeing worsening water quality conditions in some areas, as irrigation runoff and stormwater runoff both carry contaminants such as sediment, pesticides, and nitrogen into our surface water bodies. Both specific pesticides such as bifenthrin and increased toxicity to aquatic life have also been detected. There are water quality concerns that have been worsening and continue to over time. That's why this Ag Order is in place. Now we're going into the requirements of Ag Order 4.0. These are general requirements expected of growers enrolled in the Irrigated Lands Program. Hopefully, in reading the list of requirements that I'll share here, you will see that these are not new. You are already doing these things, so please continue to do so. Enrollment in Ag Order, the Ag Order with the Irrigated Lands Program is required for all operations irrigating and producing commercial crops, and should be done online through GeoTracker. Please contact us if you have questions about enrollment. Please update your electronic notice of intent, or ENOI, within 60 days of a change in ENOI information. Along these lines, there are some updates to the ENOI form that growers are required to fill out by September 13th, 2021. This includes information regarding drinking water notifications, surface water bodies, slopes, and impermeable surfaces. Growers must pay annual permit fees. There is a significant fee break for enrollees in third-party programs versus individual dischargers. This is an incentive to be enrolled in a third-party program. Additionally, growers are required to obtain water quality education in order to improve management practices and assess effectiveness, with the intent of changing practices based on water quality in their area. You do not need to report this information to the water board, but it is required. Continual improvement is the underlying basis of how we plan to improve water quality. Therefore, it is required to implement and assess effectiveness of management practices. This means if something is working, keep using it, and if something is not, stop and try something else. The farm plan and annual compliance form, or ACF, are tools to implement and assess effectiveness of management practices. The farm plan is kept on the farm, and in Ag Order 4.0, there are specific sections which growers must have related to irrigation and nutrient management, pesticides management, and sediment management. Third-party programs may develop a template to assist their members with this requirement. As many growers completed in Ag Order 3.0, now all growers must submit an annual compliance form, or ACF, through GeoTracker. Here, growers report summary information on management practices, effectiveness assessments, and documents change in water quality conditions. Next, Sarah will be talking about additional requirements that are specific to groundwater protection.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bragg-Flavin, a water resource control engineer in the Irrigated Lands program. I'm going to introduce the topics we'll be covering in this section. So first, I'll be sharing about the incentives for growers to participate in the third-party alternative compliance pathway program, which may assist growers with complying with groundwater protection requirements. Then we'll be going over fertilizer, nitrogen application targets and limits. These are crop-specific amounts of fertilizer nitrogen that growers need to work towards achieving. Before moving on, I want to cover what we mean by targets and limits. First, targets and limits are numerical requirements that have been adopted in Ag Order 4.0. Targets are not enforceable. And what this means, if a grower has difficulty in achieving targets, we may require additional education, additional management practices, or the grower to hire a consultant to help them dial in their management practices. Limits are enforceable. And what this means is if a grower cannot achieve compliance, a grower may be facing enforcement. Next, we'll go over the nitrogen discharge to groundwater targets and limits. These targets and limits are based on nitrogen applied and nitrogen removed from a ranch. The intent of these targets and limits are to reduce the amount of nitrogen discharged from irrigation water to irrigated lands to groundwater. Then wrapping up the groundwater protection requirements section, we'll provide an overview of what growers have to monitor and what and when growers have to report to the water board. As shared, I'm providing an overview of these topics. The water board will be providing workshops that go into the details of these requirements in the near future. So, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. Before going into the requirements, I want to cover the incentives for growers to join the third-party Alternative Compliance Pathway Program, or 3P ACP program. The benefits of being a member of the program include having targets instead of limits. We'll be discussing the targets associated with the program in greater detail in later slides. The members have more time to comply with those targets, and the members of the 3P ACP program are not subject to ranch-level groundwater discharge monitoring. We'll be discussing that towards the end of this section. The 3P ACP administrator will be reaching out to their members to give more information. Again, please remember that we currently have one third-party administrator approved, Central Coast Water Quality Preservation, Inc. And if you're interested in joining them, you must enroll with them directly. Okay. Fertilizer nitrogen application targets and limits are new requirements in Ag Order 4.0. These are to reduce the over-application of fertilizer nitrogen that is above what crops use. The 3P ACP program members have targets. All other growers have limits. These are targets or limits of fertilizer nitrogen applied to a crop, which is why the units are pounds of nitrogen per crop acre. These targets or limits are above or within the California Department of Food and Agriculture, or CDFA, Fertilizer Research and Education Program recommendations for nitrogen application of these crops. There are specific targets or limits for 6 crops and 1 for all other crops. Most ranches are already meeting these targets or limits. Remember, these targets or limits are intended to address a small subset of ranches or outliers over applying fertilizer nitrogen. This is the table of fertilizer nitrogen application targets and limits. Walking through the table, in the left-hand column is the list of crops for which limits have been established, as well as the last row for all other crops. The middle column has the limits that go into effect in 2023, and the final column shows the limits that go into effect in 2025. These are a slight decrease from the 2023 limits. As an example, if I am a grower and I'm growing a lettuce crop and a celery crop in 2023, I could apply 275 pounds of fertilizer nitrogen per acre to the lettuce crop and be in compliance. And then I can grow my second crop of celery and apply 360 pounds of fertilizer nitrogen per acre to the celery crop and be in compliance. Now remember that we introduced the benefits that members of the 3P ACP program have, including having targets instead of limits and having more time to meet those targets. Now shown for the members of the program, they would have to achieve their targets 1 year later than non-members. And again, remember that most ranches are already meeting these targets and limits. I'm now going to be talking about nitrogen discharge to groundwater targets and limits. Again, the 3P ACP program members have the benefit of having nitrogen discharge targets. All other growers have targets and limits. What is nitrogen discharge? Nitrogen discharge is the nitrogen that's available to be discharged to groundwater from all crops grown on a ranch within a year. The units are pounds of nitrogen per ranch acre, and compliance is at the ranch level and not the crop level. The general equation for nitrogen discharge is nitrogen applied minus nitrogen removed. Nitrogen applied includes nitrogen in fertilizer, nitrogen in irrigation water, plus any other product applied that contains nitrogen. Nitrogen removed is mainly the nitrogen removed when the crops are harvested. So now growers need to know how much they harvest and the concentration of nitrogen in the plant material that is removed. We have the nitrogen concentration of plant material or nitrogen removal coefficients for many of the crops grown in the region. Also, some woody crops retain or sequester nitrogen in their trunks. This is considered nitrogen removed. In addition, there are different types of nitrogen removal that can be from treatment systems, such as wood chip bioreactors, for example. Now a little more on nitrogen removal coefficients. We have ongoing efforts to increase the number of crops which we have nitrogen removal coefficients for. We are working with CDFA, and it is our understanding within the year we'll have coefficients for additional 20 crops. Also within the year, we'll have the standard protocol for growers to develop their own coefficients. We are coordinating with CDFA and the University of California Cooperative Extension on this. To introduce the formulas, there are 3 formulas, or what in the order are called compliance pathways. Growers only have to comply by 1 formula or pathway. Based on growers' reported data, we will be calculating nitrogen discharge. The table presented is a nitrogen discharge targets and limits. In the first column are simplified compliance pathways formulas. In the next column are the 2023 targets, then the 2025 targets. The next column presents the 2027 limits. The squiggly line between the 2027 limit and the 2051 limit is to represent that after 2027, there are 3 limits decreasing over time before the final nitrogen discharge limit in 2051, presented in the last column. So just to refresh, that there are more limits after the 2027 limit and before the 2051 limit. For the first compliance pathway shown in the table, the A is nitrogen applied and the R is nitrogen removed. And in this pathway, the nitrogen applied includes the nitrogen in irrigation water, as shown as A-IR. In the following 2 compliance pathways, the nitrogen in irrigation water is not included in the compliance pathway formula. This is to incentivize the use of nitrogen in irrigation water. The targets and the limits apply to all ranches and are not phased in. However, the monitoring and reporting to the Water Board of nitrogen discharge to groundwater is phased in. This means that growers have an opportunity to evaluate their ability to meet their targets and limits prior to reporting on it. For the first few years, Ag Order 4.0 is in effect. All growers have targets, which are not enforceable. Looking at the first compliance pathway on the table, many, if not most growers, are already achieving the 500 pounds of nitrogen per ranch acre target. Then beginning in 2027, growers complying individually must comply with limits, which are enforceable. Many growers are also meeting this limit, but some growers will have to adjust their management practices to better balance the nitrogen applied minus nitrogen removed to meet the first limit and subsequent limits. We recognize that it takes time to change and to dial in management practices. The targets and limits decrease over 30 years to the final limit of 50 pounds of nitrogen per ranch acre. The purpose of this reduction over time is to reduce nitrogen discharge and be protective of water quality. If a grower is a member of the third-party alternative compliance pathway program, they have the benefits we have covered of having targets and having more time to comply. There is follow-up if a member of the program is unable to meet the targets. The third party will be following up with them, and they may have additional requirements. Now, in the last column, we have groundwater protection area targets instead of our previous individual limits. The work ahead for the third-party alternative compliance pathway program is to develop and have approved by the executive officer the alternative area-specific targets for nitrogen discharge to groundwater on behalf of its members. The program will be developing work plans in a stepwise process that will yield the groundwater protection area targets. As the program members have the Water Board determined targets in the first few years of that Ag Order 4.0 is in effect, the program needs to develop targets beginning after 2028 that are protective of water quality. The program administrator will be providing more information to the growers about this effort as their third-party program gets underway. Please remember that we currently have one third-party administrator approved, Central Coast Water Quality Preservation, Inc. And if you're interested in joining them, you have to enroll with them directly. Now going on to the incentives for reducing nitrogen discharge built into Ag Order 4.0. The general nitrogen applied minus nitrogen removed equals nitrogen discharge equation as on the slide for reference. As previously mentioned, the ways we're incentivizing the use of nitrogen irrigation water is by not including it in 2 of the 3 compliance pathway formulas. Discounts solely apply to the nitrogen applied. The discounts available are for nitrogen applied in organic fertilizer and nitrogen applied in compost. Credits apply to nitrogen removed and are received for specific management practices. Growers using the management practices of cover crops, high carbon amendments, and woody mulch may receive increased nitrogen removal or credits. And remember, we will be providing workshops covering nitrogen discharge to groundwater requirements, compliance pathways, targets, limits, incentives, and reporting in detail. I encourage you to attend. I'm going to be handing it back to Lauren to cover the groundwater protection, monitoring, and reporting. We'll have time for questions after Lauren completes the remainder of the section. You're welcome to hold your questions until then or place them in the chat. Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, now we will be going into the groundwater protection, monitoring, and reporting. This section includes all of the things you're going to need to do in terms of monitoring and reporting to comply with the requirements in Ag Order 4.0. You'll need to conduct this monitoring for your own record keeping and farm management purposes, as well as to monitor water quality for human health considerations and to report data to the Water Board for compliance with Ag Order 4.0. In the next 2 slides, I will be discussing the groundwater phase areas, which will help you determine the dates of which the monitoring and reporting requirements apply to your ranches, and when you'll need to begin this monitoring and reporting. We took a phased-in approach for some requirements to provide growers with time to get up to speed with the groundwater protection, monitoring, and reporting requirements. We defined 3 groundwater phase areas for our region that will be shown on a map in the following slide. The groundwater phase areas are assigned to individual ranches based on their location. Locations with the most impaired groundwater and highest recharge areas were prioritized as groundwater phase 1 areas. Groundwater phase 1 areas are going to have to report some information sooner than groundwater phase 2 or groundwater phase 3 areas. You may recall that ranches were tiered under Ag Order 3.0 to determine the monitoring and reporting requirements that apply to each enrolled ranch. This tiering assignment no longer applies under Ag Order 4.0. Now we have groundwater phase areas, and unlike the tiering, all growers eventually must comply with all requirements. If you're wondering how to find your ranch's groundwater phase area, this information is located on your ranch ENOI. You can view your ranch's groundwater phase area by logging into GeoTracker, then locating the ranch you'd like to review and clicking on the Edit Ranch Info button. This will take you to your ranch ENOI, and you will find the groundwater phase area in the top right of the page, just like you're seeing on the slide here. This is also where you can find your ranch's surface water priority area, which we will be discussing after the break. Also, hopefully you received the email that we sent you sharing the groundwater phase information for your ranches. This map is to help you get an idea of where your ranch may fall into a groundwater phase area. The phase 1 areas are the dark gray, the phase 2 areas are in the lighter gray, and finally the phase 3 areas are the remaining non-shaded areas of the map. The approximate basins and subbasins that fall into the respective groundwater phase areas are listed on the right for your reference. Please remember that your groundwater phase area is located on your ranch ENOI. Next, I'll be discussing the irrigation and nutrient management plan monitoring and reporting requirement. Okay, now we're going to talk about the irrigation and nutrient management monitoring and reporting. In order to comply with the order's targets and limits and improve water quality, growers will have to collect and report specific measured, or in some cases, estimated information about their nutrient and irrigation management practices. On this slide, you'll see a list of the components that will need to be collected. Eventually, all growers in all groundwater phase areas will need to be collecting and reporting data on an annual basis of all nitrogen applied to the ranch, irrigation practices, and all nitrogen removed from the ranch. But we're phasing in when this needs to be tracked and reported. We'll show that in the next slide. The data that is collected under the total nitrogen applied umbrella, which is the first column in this slide, would be used in the total nitrogen applied report that groundwater phase 2 and 3 area growers will be reporting until they are reporting this information in the Irrigation and Nutrient Management Plan, or INMP summary report, seen in the second column of this slide. Where you see the arrows in this slide, the nitrogen applied and the irrigation information are the same information, with the exception that the irrigation information will be collected as estimated values in the TNA requirement and will be required to be measured once the grower is reporting in the INMP summary report. Estimated irrigation information is roughly calculated by whatever means the grower feels appropriate. Under the INMP summary report, the irrigation information must be measured with the equipment that can provide an accurate value, such as a flow meter for irrigation water volume. Please note that the TNA report makes up the first section reported in the INMP. The additional piece of information reported in the INMP summary report would be the nitrogen removed from the field. All of this information is being collected to assess how well the nutrient and irrigation management practices are performing to help growers achieve the discharge targets and limits. Now, this slide will show the timeline of the phasing in of these requirements. As we discussed earlier, each ranch has a designated groundwater phase area. Growers in groundwater phase 2 and 3 areas need to report only the TNA and some irrigation information for the first few years the order is in effect. This is reported in the standalone TNA report available on GeoTracker. For example, groundwater phase 2 area ranches will collect TNA information starting in 2023 and will be reported in the following year. Then on a phased in basis, they must add total nitrogen removed and additional irrigation information to their monitoring and reporting starting in 2025, which will be reported in the Irrigation and Nutrient Management Plan, or INMP summary report, the following year. The first stage, when only TNA and certain irrigation information is required, is reported in the total nitrogen applied, or TNA report, available on GeoTracker now. Coming back to groundwater phase 1 areas, due to the magnitude of groundwater impairment and recharge characteristics in groundwater phase 1 areas, growers with ranches in groundwater phase 1 areas must monitor and report all this required information, which includes nitrogen applied, nitrogen removed, and irrigation information measured before the ranches in the other phase areas. Just like the other phase areas, when all of the required information is reported, this will be done through the INMP summary report, which will be available on GeoTracker within the next few months. To reiterate, the TNA report makes up the first section of the INMP summary report. Growers who have been submitting total nitrogen applied reports under previous ag orders will continue to do so until the respective TNA or INMP requirement is into effect under Ag Order 4.0. Now we'll discuss on-farm domestic well monitoring and reporting. You can comply as an individual or through a third-party program. The definition of an on-farm domestic well is a well that provides water for drinking and bathing and is installed on the property of an active farm. You will need to coordinate with laboratories directly to conduct sampling and analysis. An updated list of approved laboratories will be available on our website soon. For this monitoring and reporting requirement, all ranches will need to collect samples from all of their domestic wells on the farm property starting in 2022. The annual sampling will need to occur between March 1st and May 31st, and those results will need to be uploaded by the laboratory to GeoTracker by July 31st. This requirement is not phased in, but applies to all growers. Samples must be analyzed for nitrate and 1,2,3-trichloropropane or TCP. This is a reduction in parameters compared to Ag Order 3.0. As we discussed in earlier water quality conditions slide, 1,2,3-TCP was added because it was detected in domestic wells that were also detecting elevated nitrate. 1,2,3-TCP is a public health concern that we need to assess. Please note that monitoring for 1,2,3-TCP may be reduced and ended over time, depending on whether it is detected in the well. We will be coordinating with laboratories to make sure they are prepared to conduct the analyses required for on-farm well sampling. Growers must provide well users and any new well users with a summary of the nitrate and 1,2,3-TCP results within 3 business days of receiving them from the laboratory. We will call this, or we do call this, the drinking water notification. Next, we will discuss the primary irrigation well monitoring. Okay, the main or primary irrigation well used on the ranch must be monitored for the next few years the order is in effect. Like the on-farm domestic well monitoring requirement that we just discussed, the primary irrigation well will need to be monitored annually starting in 2022. Please keep in mind that this monitoring will only be required until trend monitoring begins. The purpose of this requirement is to evaluate groundwater conditions in agricultural areas and to inform the establishment of a groundwater quality trend monitoring network that is representative of groundwater in the Central Coast region. In the years where sampling of the primary irrigation well is required in lieu of the groundwater quality trend monitoring, annual sampling and reporting is to occur during the same time periods as the on-farm domestic well sampling. The primary irrigation well is to be analyzed for nitrogen and total dissolved solids, or TDS. Please note that this is a reduction of parameters from what was required in Ag Order 3.0. Groundwater quality trend monitoring is intended to determine if water quality is improving, maintaining, or degrading over time in agricultural areas. All growers have the option to comply with this requirement individually or as a third-party member. The key thing to note here is if you are a member of a third party, the third party will prepare, submit, and carry out the work plan, including sampling, data reporting, and trend evaluation. If you are not a third-party member, you as an individual grower must conduct all these actions on your own. The first step in complying with this requirement is the development of a trend monitoring work plan. Whether you're complying as an individual or as a third-party member, a work plan will need to be submitted detailing how groundwater quality trend monitoring will occur. One of the main components of the work plan is a defined trend monitoring well network. That includes wells that may be existing or newly installed. The work plan must be developed and submitted by the following dates. For groundwater phase 1 areas, the work plan must be submitted by September 1st, 2023. For groundwater phase 2 areas, the work plan must be submitted by September 1st, 2025. And for groundwater phase 3 areas, that date is September 1st, 2027. Well sampling and reporting is required on a semi-annual basis for growers not in a third-party program. If you are a member of a third-party program, monitoring and reporting must occur with the executive officer approved schedule that would be contained in the third-party trend monitoring work plan. In either case, a groundwater quality trend evaluation report must be submitted to the water board. Remember that for the individual option, annual trend reports are required. For the third-party option, the schedule for trend evaluation reporting will be determined in the executive officer approved work plan. Next, we will discuss ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring. If a grower repeatedly does not meet the nitrogen discharge targets or limits, they may be subject to ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring. This is not required of every grower, but at the discretion of the executive officer. This means monitoring of discharge of groundwater would be monitored and reported at a ranch level by the individual grower rather than at a regional level. Branch level groundwater discharge monitoring may be required as a consequence for significant and repeated exceedance of nitrogen discharge targets or limits. This requirement is not only a consequence, but in place to help growers dial in their management practices to further reduce nitrogen discharge by reducing application from fertilizers and irrigation water to meet targets and limits. This type of monitoring could be achieved by utilizing tools such as lysimeters for monitoring at or below the root zone. Lysimeters are only one example of techniques that could be used to achieve this monitoring. Please note that this level of monitoring may be discontinued after targets or limits are met. Also keep in mind, if you're a member of the third-party alternative compliance pathway or 3P ACP that Sarah had discussed earlier, this requirement does not apply to you. To sum things up, here are some important takeaways regarding the groundwater protection requirements. As we discussed previously, there is currently one approved third-party program available to assist you with compliance of AgWater 4.0. If you would like to be enrolled with the third party, you will need to enroll with them directly. Many growers have previously reported on similar requirements seen in the first few years of the order. Starting next year, some are phased in after that. The intent of phasing is to allow time for growers to be able to comply with the requirements. Generally, make sure to gain familiarity with the monitoring and reporting requirements in AgWater 4.0. You'll begin record keeping and collecting data for nitrogen application reporting soon. As we discussed in this order, there are fertilizer nitrogen application targets or limits. You'll need to collect total nitrogen applied information, and how and when this information is reported is dependent on your ranch's groundwater phase area. Nitrogen removed data collection and reporting for INMP summary report is phased in by groundwater phase area. There are nitrogen discharge targets and limits that need to be met over time. Meeting these targets and limits is assessed by the information you report in your INMP summary report. All domestic wells and the primary irrigation well on all enrolled ranches will need to be sampled annually. Primary irrigation well sampling will occur annually until groundwater quality trend monitoring begins based on your groundwater phase area. Groundwater trend monitoring may be done as an individual or through a third party. If you are reporting as an individual, you will need to submit a work plan for water board approval. Ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring may be required as a consequence, as well as a tool to assist growers with achieving groundwater discharge targets and limits. So now we are open for questions on this portion of the presentation. And just a reminder that this workshop is meant to be a high-level overview of the requirements, and there will be future workshops focused on specifics of monitoring and reporting requirements. Please use the raise hand feature to ask your question, and we will call on you one at a time by your name or phone number. You may also type your question in the chat. If you are calling in and you have a question, please press *9 to raise your hand. And when your name or number is called, press *6 to unmute or mute. And now we'll take your questions.
Excuse me, just before we start taking the questions, I just want to perhaps remind people or tell them perhaps for the first time that the raised hand feature is accessed through the reactions icon down at the bottom of your screen, down in the lower right in most cases. Thank you.
So we do have a question in the chat from Zach Brissel. Where can we get a copy of this presentation?
So this presentation will be posted to our website soon. I'm not sure on the exact timeline. Somebody else might be able to weigh in on that, but we will be posting both, I believe definitely the recording of this presentation so you can hear the question and answers, and as well as our talking points. And then I believe, will the PowerPoint be posted as well as a PDF?
Yes, it will.
Yeah.
All right, and now we have a question from Lowell Zielinski. Lowell, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, a couple of quick questions. I know we have to update our ENOIs fairly quickly. One of the components is the drinking water notification confirmation.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't done this in the past, how do you answer the questions? Because you can't say your ENOI unless you answer those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, have well users been provided with the summary of the sampling results for each on-farm domestic well? If you haven't done it in the past, you answer yes or no.
Yeah, so are you asking in the event that samples have never been collected for that ranch?
Possibly yes.
Okay, in that case, just answer no, and then I think it's the last question, there's an NA option, and you'll just select NA. When you do, just make sure when samples are collected, because they'll be required in 2022, just make sure to update that in your ENOI. Or in the ENOI once that has been completed. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And if you are the owner and you have one house on your ranch, and it's a domestic well plus an irrigation well, like a small vineyard,
mm-hmm.
What is meant by notification in that instance? So
is that in the event that the operator is also living in that home?
Yes.
In that case, Diane, do you mind weighing in on that?
Sure. So in that case, if the residents are and the operator are one and the same, then in terms of the health information, really all that needs to be provided is just information that's posted so that the well user is aware of the health effects. So with respect to filling out your ENOI, in that particular case, you would have to answer yes, that they were provided by the health risk information if, for instance, that was actually the case.
Okay. And then one last question on the ENOI. And then the additional questions, it says something about put the maximum slope in. Are you going to have a methodology for determining the maximum slope?
Could either Elaine or Diane answer that question, please?
Hi, Lowell, this is Elaine.
Hi, Elaine.
Included as part of the instructions, there is a methodology, there is a formula and instructions on how to go about calculating the maximum slope. So I would first recommend that you refer to the instructions, and if that is still unclear, we could coordinate further.
Okay, and I'm sorry, one last question, Elaine. I've asked you this before. I have many ranches that exceed the 640 acre limit. How have you thought about how you're going to deal with that?
At this time, no, we have not come up with any specific instructions. And for others, just for others' awareness, there is a specific requirement in the order that says if your ranch is greater than 640 acres, you have to have separate irrigation and nutrient management plan reports. We don't have too many ranches that are above 640 acres. But again, Lowell, for those that are, we will be coming up with some additional instructions for you on that in the future, but we don't have that yet.
Okay, thank you, Ellen.
Thank you.
Great. We have another question from Zach Russell. His question is, can you please explain how you calculate nitrogen removal?
Hi, Zach. Thank you for your question. So nitrogen removal contains a couple components. The most common one is the nitrogen removed when you harvest a crop. So a grower would need to know how much they harvested, and then we use the nitrogen removal coefficients to determine how much nitrogen is in that crop to create the total amount of nitrogen removed in that crop. There are also the nitrogen sequestered in perennial crops. And if you have treatment systems such as a wood chip bioreactor on your place, those will be individually, and we can work with growers with you in the future and in more detail on the upcoming workshops addressing nitrogen discharge to groundwater. If I did not answer your question, please, can you provide more clarity of what you're looking for in the chat? Also, I'll pause to allow Elaine or Diane to also comment on this question.
All right. Our next question is from Meredith Fisher. Meredith wants to know if we could restate the compliance date for phase 1 area trend monitoring.
Yeah, for groundwater phase 1 areas, that would be September 1st, 2023 for the work plan.
Our next question from the chat is from Kelly McCoon. I apologize if I butchered your last name, Kelly. Can you please restate the individual trend monitoring timeline and how to define well network to use for this trend monitoring if individually complying?
So the timeline for the work plan is the same as the group. So if depending on your phase area, it would be for phase 1, it would be by September 1st, 2023. Phase 2 would be 2025, and phase 3 would be 2027. As far as, and sorry, could you read that last portion? Was it about the individual? Let's see if I can find it.
Define well network to use for this trend monitoring if individually complying.
I'll jump in here.
Okay.
Yes, so if you're going with the individual approach for the groundwater quality trend monitoring, then you would be required to be monitoring all of the wells on your farm for trends.
Our next question is, if you have no wells on the property, do you have to report anything?
Yes. So if you have no wells on the property, and I'm going to assume for well, for the monitoring, just the groundwater monitoring, in that case, you would not have to do sampling if there are no wells on the property, but you would have to participate in the groundwater trend monitoring. And how you decide to do that, you can either do that through a third party, or you can do that through do that individually. But yeah, so it really depends on which route you decide to go.
Just to clarify that a little bit more, if you are opting for the individual option for the groundwater quality trend monitoring, and you have no well on your property, then the monitoring and reporting program associated with this order lists out for potential possibilities for you to be able to provide data. The first option could be that you install a monitoring well or wells to be able to sufficiently characterize the groundwater quality trends on your property. Another option would be to develop a coordinated monitoring program by partnering with some adjacent property owners with wells, and allow you to essentially form a very small kind of third-party option. Another option for you would be to obtain authorization from an adjacent property owner that does have one or more wells and collect the water quality samples from their wells yourself. And then lastly, the fourth option would be to obtain authorization from individual property owners or a third-party program to utilize their water quality data. And that condition of authorization is really up to the negotiating parties to determine what that would actually come down to in terms of the permission to share that information.
It looks like Zach has a clarifying question in the chat, and he also has his hand raised. So Zach, I am going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi there, thank you. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of the nitrogen removal question, are you going to be considering management practices such as pruning, and also for orchards, natural leaf drop, because that's a natural occurrence for many different tree types? Part of their cycle is to drop leaves and then they grow new leaves.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
also,
thank you.
And also fruit drop is also a natural occurrence as well.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I'll provide a little bit more detail. We covered the incentives built into Ag Order 4.0 for reducing nitrogen discharge, and one of those was the a credit and certain management practices, including woody mulch, which we worked, which would hopefully cover pruning, whether it's tree crops or vineyards or berries would be included in those kind of practices. And then getting onto your natural, the cycles for leaf drop and fruit drop, those aren't directly built into the equations at this point, but if there are estimates, we do have a potential way for growers to calculate those using an R other. And we can get into all of these in detail in the future workshops, going through the specifics of the compliance pathways. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
We have a question in the chat. The question is, we are next to a 18-hole golf course that is fertilizing also, and we have never had issues until the last couple of years, and we have been here for 40 years. We have not changed our practices, but our nitrogen limits have gone up since the golf course was established. We draw from the same aquifer. How can we control that without cutting out our nitrogen and hurting our crops? Do they have some sort of monitoring?
Okay, thank you for your question. So the nitrogen, fertilizer nitrogen application limits and targets are by crop, and the nitrogen discharge targets and limits are by the activities you take on your ranch. So you wouldn't be out of compliance if you're meeting those targets and limits, but this order may help us understand where the impacts are coming from. And if it is your next door golf course, that would be something that we would hope to learn. I will leave, I'll pause to allow Diane or Elaine to further explain.
So I'll wait in here. So with respect to this order, the golf course would not have any monitoring requirements. However, if that golf course is somehow regulated by some other aspect of our office, for instance, if they have some sort of some other kind of a waste discharge monitoring program, then it's likely that groundwater monitoring could be a part of that. But it's not necessarily the case that we would have any groundwater data associated with that golf course. So I think we have time for one more question, and then unfortunately we're going to have to move on. And at that point in time, if your question hasn't been answered, please provide it to us via email or phone. And we will also have a record of the chat so we can address those questions that have already been provided in the chat. So one more, please.
Our last question is from Corey, how to access GeoTracker. So how do they access GeoTracker?
So GeoTracker is an online database, and I don't have the website memorized. I don't know if anybody does, but you could Google GeoTracker ESI and it'll pop up. And on there you'll be, you should also, so that's how you get to the website. Also, if you go to our website and if you either you have an enrollment already or if you don't, you can access it from our website. It'll take you directly to GeoTracker. But feel free to send us an email and we can walk you through that process.
All right. Again, thank you for all of your questions. And for those that we didn't get to so far at this particular point in time, there will be another opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions on this particular portion of our presentation. But you can also provide us with your questions in an email or call us. And again, we have the chat so we can go back through that and answer your questions that way. At this point in time, we're going to take a 10-minute break. So let's all be back to start up the next session of our presentation at 20 after 11. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. It is 11:20 right now, and we're going to pick up where we left off. So Jacqueline, or Jamie actually, is going to take the next part of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Jamie Pratt, and I am an environmental scientist for the Irrigated Lands program. During this portion of the presentation, I will provide an overview of Ag Order 4.0's surface water protection requirements. These include the surface receiving water limits, such as those for nutrients, pesticides, and sediment. These limits apply to what we call the surface receiving waters in our region, which include, for example, our creeks and our streams. After I discuss the surface receiving water limits, I will go over our surface water monitoring and reporting requirements. I'll start with an overview of surface water quality trend monitoring. Then I will discuss follow-up surface receiving water implementation, and I'll finish the surface water protection portion of this presentation by going over the potential for ranch level surface discharge monitoring and reporting. Ag Order 4.0 establishes surface receiving water limits for nutrients such as nitrate, pesticides, toxicity, turbidity, and sediment. The first limit must be met in year 2032, and then the timeline continues, and due dates depend on the watershed where a ranch is located. So now that 4.0 is in effect, growers in the third-party program have about 10 years to find solutions, adjust, and adapt to meet the first surface receiving water limits on time. Water Board staff or the third-party program will be contacting growers to let them know which limits and timelines apply to the watersheds where their ranches are located. We also anticipate having interactive tools on our website so that anyone can see which limits and timelines apply to their watersheds of interest. As a quick overview, Ag Order 4.0 includes 3 types of surface water monitoring and reporting requirements that I'll be going over in more detail in future slides. These include surface receiving water quality trends that occurs at the receiving water level in our creeks and streams, follow-up surface receiving water implementation that also occurs in our creeks and streams and begins based on a ranch's location and surface water priority area designation, and ranch level surface discharge monitoring and reporting that occurs at the edge of field and may be required on a case-by-case basis. Like I said, I'll be going into more detail on each of these monitoring and reporting types in the next few slides. And as I do, please keep in mind that all of these requirements can be completed by the third-party program on behalf of their member growers. So Ag Order 4.0 continues the surface receiving water quality trends monitoring in our region's receiving waters that occurred under previous Ag Orders. Currently, Central Coast Water Quality Preservation, Inc.'s cooperative monitoring program completes this for most growers. And as stated earlier, they are an approved third-party program administrator and will continue to complete this requirement for their member growers under Ag Order 4.0. This requirement includes submitting a work plan by July 1st, 2022, that in general identifies monitoring locations, what will be monitored, and a schedule. The data from this monitoring will be used to help assess the impact agriculture has on water quality. This is important because it will show where progress is being made to meet limits and where extra assistance may be needed before compliance dates. All of this is summarized every year and submitted electronically to us as an annual report. And again, if growers are members of the third-party program, then all of this will be taken care of on their behalf. Ag Order 4.0 introduces follow-up monitoring and reporting requirements, which are still focused on surface receiving waters in our creeks and our streams. Essentially, this follow-up requires development of a work plan that informs growers of water quality in the watersheds where their ranches are located and identifies actions needed to achieve and maintain compliance with limits. Ranches are assigned a surface water priority area based on their location. For growers who are not members of the third-party program and choose to develop their own follow-up implementation work plan, their ranches are assigned a priority area of 1, 2, 3, or 4, and the work plan due dates are staggered by year beginning in 2023 with ranches located in surface water priority area 1. For growers that are members of the third-party program, their ranches are assigned a priority area of high, medium, or low, and the work plan due dates are staggered by 2 years, beginning in 2024, with ranches located in high priority areas. These priority areas are displayed on each ranch ENOI, and an example is pictured here on the slide where the bottom right is circled in red. Some of the expectations for the work plan include identification of additional monitoring locations to assess if water quality is getting better or worse, and to determine actions that can be taken to improve or continue protecting water quality. In areas with water quality impairments, work plans will focus on identifying the source of pollutants and prevention. This could include actions such as implementing additional management practices or adapting management practices based on water quality. In the work plans, growers must demonstrate how progress is being made to reduce the pollutants identified in their area. In areas already meeting surface water limits, work plans will focus on understanding and identifying what is working to maintain water quality. Every year, an annual report must be submitted to us that generally summarizes any additional monitoring data, actions taken to restore or protect water quality, such as a description of management practices or other follow-up activities, and whether what was done helped to meet limits. And again, the third-party program will work with their members to complete this. Now I will discuss the potential requirement for ranch level surface discharge monitoring and reporting. This edge of field monitoring may be required as a consequence in a couple of instances. The first potential instance would be for growers that are not members of the third-party program who have persistent surface receiving water quality issues where their ranches are located. For example, if a ranch is in an area where the nitrate concentration in their nearby stream continues to get worse and the grower has made minimal effort to implement management practices or obtain relevant education, we'd take all of this into account when determining if a grower would be required to conduct edge of field monitoring. The second potential instance would be for any growers with ranches located in areas where surface receiving water limits are not met on time. Again, though, this would be determined on a case-by-case basis. If, for example, a pesticide limit is the only limit not being met in a nearby stream, then a grower who doesn't use pesticides on the ranch wouldn't be required to conduct edge of field monitoring. I also want to reiterate that in this case, growers in the third-party program wouldn't potentially be required to do this until after 2032, when the first limits must be met. Water board staff will provide advance notice to growers and coordinate prior to requiring edge of field monitoring. And if it is required, staff or the third-party program will work with the grower to develop a work plan and determine what needs to be monitored, the frequency, and the duration. The goal of this requirement is to work with growers and use the edge of field monitoring results to determine how individual ranches are impacting water quality and to let us know what needs to be done to ensure the surface water limits are met. This ranch level discharge monitoring and reporting may be discontinued once the limits have been met or discharge has stopped. So now I'll go over some important takeaways from this portion of the presentation on surface water protection. First, the third-party program will be available to assist growers with these requirements, and of course, water board staff are also available to help. Next, remember we talked about the surface receiving water quality limits. They have timelines associated with them, with the first in 2032 and others coming in after that. Water board staff or the third-party program will let growers know which limits and timelines apply to the watersheds where their ranches are located well in advance of compliance dates. Ag Order 4 also continues the requirements for surface water quality trends monitoring and reporting. We will use this information to evaluate where, for example, nutrient, pesticide, or sediment problems persist, and to help inform the development of follow-up implementation work plans. These follow-up implementation work plans are watershed specific and will be developed based on a ranch's priority area to help growers achieve limits by their compliance dates and to maintain water quality thereafter. Lastly, ranch level surface discharge monitoring will only be required as a consequence when growers that are not members of the third-party program are not making adequate progress to meet surface receiving water limits, or when any grower, third-party program members or not, have a ranch located in an area where a limit has not been met by its compliance date. So now we are open for questions on this portion of the presentation. And just a reminder that this workshop is meant to be a high-level overview of the requirements, and there will be future workshops focused on the specifics of monitoring and reporting requirements. So you can use the raise hand feature to ask your questions, or feel free to type them in the chat. If you are calling into this meeting, press *9 to raise your hand. And then when you are called on, press *6 to unmute yourself or to mute yourself.
And once again, just a reminder, the raised hand feature can be accessed through the reactions icon down at the bottom of your screen. Okay, let's give it another minute in case someone is mulling over a question on the surface water protection. All right, it doesn't appear that we do have any questions. So Jamie, would you please move on to the next segment?
Sure thing. So as a closing, I'm gonna briefly go over again all of the requirements that are coming up in the next 3 years. This year in 2021, all growers are required to update their operation and ranch enrollment forms called the ENOIs on GeoTracker by September 13th. Also remember that as any changes occur, the ENOI must be updated within 60 days. For example, some of the things you may need to update within 60 days of a change include the responsible party's contact information, ranch contact information, maybe irrigated acreage, or if the number of domestic wells or irrigation wells on the ranch change. It's important for growers to keep their ENOIs updated because we rely on the contact information when we send notification emails, such as for upcoming requirements. Additionally, each year growers must pay annual permit fees, which most of you have already done this year. And here it is important to note that the third-party program members receive a reduced annual permit fee. As Sarah and Lauren discussed earlier, growers required under Ag Order 3.0 to submit total nitrogen applied data called the TNA report must continue to maintain records and submit their TNA report on GeoTracker by March 1st every year until the Irrigation and Nutrient Management Plan Summary Report, or INMP Summary Report, requirement is phased in for their ranches. Again, every year growers are required to pay their annual permit fees, keeping in mind that the third-party program members receive a reduced annual permit fee. Every year starting in 2022, all growers are required to submit the annual compliance form on GeoTracker. The annual compliance form, or ACF, includes information on farm plan development and implementation, such as identifying the management practices being implemented on each ranch. Also, starting in 2022, like Lauren mentioned, all growers will be required to sample all of their on-farm domestic wells between March 1st and May 31st and report that information on GeoTracker by July 31st annually. These annual requirements that I just mentioned will keep applying each year, but won't be shown on the next slides for year 2023 and 2024, but I'll remind you that they still apply. For new requirements in 2022, all ranches must sample their primary irrigation well between March 1st and May 31st and report that information by July 31st every year until the groundwater trend monitoring requirements start. By July 1st, 2022, all growers must submit their surface receiving water quality trends work plan, or this will be submitted by the third-party program on behalf of their members. Lastly, growers required to submit TNA data during Ag Order 3.0 must continue to maintain records and to submit their TNA report in GeoTracker by March 1st every year until they are required to submit the INMP summary report. So remember, here for the year 2023, the same annual requirements I mentioned on the previous slide apply, which include the requirements to pay permit fees, submit the ACF, and to sample and report data for all on-farm domestic wells. For the new requirements that are shown here, you'll see that, again, all ranches must sample their primary irrigation well and report that data on GeoTracker. This is the first year when growers who are not members of the third-party alternative compliance pathway must comply with the fertilizer nitrogen application limits, which, remember, are enforceable. And they must also comply with the first nitrogen discharge target, which is not enforceable. As Lauren and Sarah stated earlier, the fertilizer nitrogen application limits are within the CDFA guidelines, and the nitrogen discharge target has 3 compliance pathway options. For ranches required to submit TNA under Ag Order 3.0, 2023 is the last year where that requirement carries over as we transition to groundwater phase areas. And now all ranches in groundwater phase 2 and phase 3 areas must maintain records to submit their TNA report in 2024. All ranches in groundwater phase 1 areas must begin to maintain records to submit their INMP summary report in 2024, which includes nitrogen removal and more in-depth irrigation water information. And remember, the records collected and maintained during a calendar year are reported March 1st of the next year. Also in 2023, all ranches located in groundwater phase 1 must submit their groundwater trend monitoring work plan by September 1st. And lastly, growers that are not part of the third-party program with ranches located in surface water priority area 1 will have to submit their follow-up implementation work plan by March 1st. Moving on to year 2024, the same annual requirements that I mentioned previously still apply, but are not shown here. Shown here in 2024, all ranches must sample their primary irrigation well and report that data in GeoTracker. Growers that are not members of the third-party alternative compliance pathway must continue to comply with the fertilizer nitrogen application limits and the first nitrogen discharge target. And this year, growers that are members of the third-party alternative compliance pathway must comply with the fertilizer nitrogen application targets, and they must also comply with the first nitrogen discharge target. And remember, targets are not enforceable. Ranches in groundwater phase 1 areas must submit their INMP summary report by March 1st and continue to maintain their INMP records. Ranches in groundwater phases 2 and 3 must submit their TNA reports by March 1st and continue to maintain records needed to submit their TNA report until the INMP summary report requirement is phased in. And growers that are not part of the third-party program with ranches located in surface water priority area 2 must submit their follow-up implementation work plans by March 1st, 2024. And growers that are part of the third-party program with ranches located in high priority areas will have their follow-up implementation work plan submitted for them by March 1st, 2024. So now that we finished the overview of Ag Order 4.0 requirements, I'm just going to highlight again some of the resources that are available on our Irrigated Lands Program website. Our website is where we have important announcements and documents, including the compliance calendar that outlines requirements and their due dates, responses to frequently asked questions, a list of technical assistance providers and consultants, our program's individual staff contact information listed out by focus area, and a link and contact information for the approved third-party program administrator, Preservation Inc. Also, general inquiries can be made by contacting the Irrigated Lands Program, Ag NOI email or phone number, both shown here on the slide. We're also working to develop additional resources, such as the drinking water notification template for growers to provide to all domestic well users within 3 business days of receiving sampling results, a template and instructions for the individual groundwater trend monitoring work plan, report instructions for the ACF, TNA, and INMP summary reports, and information about nitrogen removal coefficients, including CDFA's development of additional crop-specific values and our work with CDFA and the UC Cooperative Extension to develop standard protocols for growers who want to determine their own crop-specific values, which will be available by April 2022. Additionally, the third-party program will be holding informational workshops in the future to let growers know about the services they will provide to help growers comply with groundwater and surface water requirements of Ag Order 4.0. We also intend to hold workshops for growers to help with the TNA report and the INMP summary report. And we also intend to hold separate workshops for technical assistance providers. And in just a moment, we'll be finishing the presentation with a quick survey to find out which future workshops everyone at this workshop today would be interested in. So before the survey, if anyone has questions on this portion of the presentation, you can raise your hand or type them in the chat now. If you're calling in, press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself. Another reminder that this presentation is just a big picture overview of Ag Order 4.0's requirements and the tools that are available for growers. More tools and workshops will be developed by us and the third-party program in the future.
So it looks like we have a few questions in the chat. So I'm going to start from the beginning. This question was asked by Gary. Is there a platform or application available for growers to gather or compile data and efforts to be in compliance?
Hi, Gary. Thank you for your question. So in the Ag Order 4.0, there is kind of where we've gone over the opportunity for a third party to assist growers in complying, and they do compile some of the data, especially with the surface water. And then in the future groundwater requirements, they'll be developing their own groundwater protection area targets. And that's kind of, you've seen Sarah Lopez comments in the chat. She leads the approved third party, and that's kind of where we're starting with this process. I'll pause to allow Elaine to probably add more detail.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'll just remind everyone that we do have another requirement that's in the Ag Order, which is for a farm water quality management plan. This farm plan is a plan that should be kept at your ranch location, and it should compile all of the data you may need to report on total nitrogen applied, your irrigation nutrient management plan, the annual compliance forms, and things such as that. It has been indicated to us by the third-party program that they may be interested in coming up with some type of template. We've also heard perhaps from some consultants that they also may be interested in helping with a template for their growers that they consult for. So there will be resources that that may be up and coming related to templates that can help you compile data that can help you maintain compliance with all of the reporting requirements.
So the next question we have from the chat is from Carl. Carl asks, why are golf courses with significant acreage and fertilizer and pesticide applications not included?
Hi, Carl. I'll work to answer your question here. As Sarah in the chat alluded to, the Ag Order 4.0 specifically regulates commercial irrigated lands, and golf courses are not included in that definition. And I'll let Diane or Elaine kind of go if they have any more information to present on how golf courses are regulated.
And I'll just add, the definition of commercial for the purposes of a grower needing to enroll in the Ag Order is that a grower sells their crops. So for the instance of the golf courses, they are not required to enroll under this Ag Order because they're not selling any crops. Yes, they do irrigate the turf. However, they are not required to enroll in this order or maintain compliance with these requirements because they do not sell commercial irrigated crops. As Diane has mentioned moments ago, that we perhaps do have other permitting requirements that the golf courses do have to maintain compliance with. Again, that would be individual requirements placed on those golf courses to reduce any discharge they may have.
And if I could add beyond that as well, as Sarah mentions in her response, Sarah Lopez, that is, the third party will certainly be aware of sources other than agriculture in the vicinity of irrigated ag that may or may not be contributing to the concentrations we're seeing, whether or not limits and targets are being achieved, et cetera. So as part of the work that the third party will be doing, it's kind of looking at a bigger picture. So that's, yeah, it won't just be a micro view, it'll be on a larger scale. For instance, a watershed view, as well as larger groundwater areas too.
So the next question we received in the chat is from Corey, and they were wondering if there was a work plan example. This was asked after the surface water requirement portion of the presentation.
Hi, Corey. Thanks for your question. So I'm thinking you're probably talking about the follow-up work plan. And so depending on whether you're part of the third party or not, the third party would work with you. And we do plan to have templates to help guide growers in the development of the farm plan sections, as well as the order outlines the different components of the work plan. So that would be on our website. Hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, our next question in the chat is from Dennis. Their question is, on an INMP slide, it said water application will have to be measured, not estimated. 1, measured per individual crop types or total water applied to the ranch. And question 2 is, can pump efficiency test / electrical usage calculations still be used, or will water meters be required?
Hi, Dennis. Thanks for your question. For the INMP summary reports, the measurement for irrigation water would be at the ranch level. And then at the crop level, measurements preferred, but estimating is allowed. And then for question number 2, when you're reporting on the INMP at the ranch level, we're moving on from the estimating using pump efficiency and electrical usage to actually having measurement, and one of those options is a water meter.
All right, our next question is from Lowell Zielinski, and Lowell also has his hand up. So Lowell, I will ask you to unmute yourself, and that way you can ask the question.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Wait, quick question on well sampling. With the domestic wells, I think the order says that the owner or the operator cannot do the sampling themselves. It has to be done by an independent third party, and not necessarily Preservation Inc., but maybe the lab or whatever. Is that true?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, then how about the primary irrigation well monitoring? Can the growers do that themselves, or does that also have to be done by an independent third party?
That would, for the irrigation well sampling to fit under the groundwater monitoring requirement, they would need to as well have the laboratory or a third party do that. Diane, please weigh in if that's incorrect. The reason I specified that is that may differ if you are sampling that well for the TNA requirement. There is the potential to use like nitrate strips for that, but for the actual groundwater sampling requirement, you would have to have a third party conduct that.
Yeah, I'll weigh in. What Lauren said is mostly correct. For INNP, irrigation and nutrient management purposes, growers are able to use a handheld measuring device. We're not going with the nitrogen or nitrate test strips, but we're looking for something that has more accuracy in terms of what the nitrate concentration is in the irrigation water. But yes, growers are able to take those measurements themselves for the irrigation and nutrient management purposes for data that will be reported in the TNA or INNP summary report.
Okay, thank you.
It looks like we have time for one more question. The question in the chat is, if no water wells are on the property and use of city water is used, do we get data from city water company?
Yes, that's correct.
That would be correct for the, well, let me just take a step back. If you're referring to reporting information associated with well concentration data for the domestic well monitoring or the primary irrigation well monitoring before the trend monitoring kicks in, then you would be reporting that you do not have any wells, 0 wells on your ENOI report or form. But for the sake of a trend monitoring, then you would need to pursue one of the 4 options that we have listed in the MRP that I read earlier, pages 18 and 19 of the monitoring and reporting program. All right, so with that, I believe we're going to be moving on to the next phase of our presentation. And again, for people whose questions were not able to be answered by us during the various question and answer periods, please put your questions to us via email or a phone call, and we will also be responding to the questions that remain in the chat that we didn't get to. Thank you.
Okay. So lastly, we'd really appreciate it if you could spare a few more minutes to answer some survey questions. If you're unable to take this survey now, please know that we still welcome your feedback. The survey questions will be posted to our website, and you can email us your responses or call with your responses. There are 4 questions in total, and we plan to use your answers as a guide for areas we focus on when developing guidance for the growers in the future. I will read the questions and survey questions on the poll, and after the poll, I'll share the results. If you're attending on the workshop on the phone and unable to participate directly, again, we welcome your responses. You can email us or call us. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll now, and I'll read the questions following launching the poll. Okay. You should now be able to see the poll on your screen. When you've selected your answers, please hit submit. If none of the options on the questions are what you're interested in, you can again include that in the chat or the email shown on the slide. So the first question, how did you hear about this workshop? There are 5 options to choose from. The second question, Which areas of Ag Order 4.0 would you like more workshops, tools, or information on? You may select multiple responses to this question. If you would like more information on all of them, the 8th option is all of the above. If you'd like information on a topic not listed, there's an other category. Please let us know what you would like more information on in the chat. The 3rd question, was the virtual format of this workshop effective? And then the last question, what is your preference for the format of future workshops? There's 5 options to choose from. So we're starting to get responses, and I'll give another minute or so to allow people to respond. So we have almost 70% of people responding. I'll give another about 30 seconds before closing the poll. Okay, a final few seconds to allow anyone close to finishing to be able to submit. Okay. I'm going to end the polling and then I'll share the results. So you're seeing these results at the same time we are. And we will use these again to influence how we'll provide assistance in the future. The orange bars are the most frequent answer. And you can see the various bars of how people heard from us and then what they're interested in the future. We're glad today's workshop the virtual format was effective and that we understand people would like that in the future. Okay, I went ahead and stopped sharing the results. If you'd like the box to disappear on your screen, you may have to close it on your own. Okay, wrapping up the workshop. Really, as stated before, if you'd like more information or assistance, please call or email us. Our program contact information is here on the screen, and one of the Irrigating Lands program staff will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you for your time, and we are continuing the series of workshops. They'll cover the same information tomorrow in Spanish from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. This was our last English presentation, and please remember we'll be posting these recordings on our website shortly.
I also would like to thank everyone for participating and sticking with this 2-hour-long workshop. I know it's kind of difficult to take time out of your workday to do this, so we really appreciate it. Thanks for all your feedback.